Before we start, I need a favor. Let me know in the comments what's been done right or wrong. This also helps me create better content for you all. And check out our Creepy Tales playlist. The videos with the most views, likes, and comments will form the channel. Also subscribe and share. And now we begin. Chapter 1. The Pattern. The missing persons reports always came in clusters. Detective Sarah Chen had noticed it 3 months into her assignment at the Redwood Valley Police Department. Every decade or so, hikers would vanish from Shadowpine National Forest. Not the usual cases of people getting lost or injured, these were different. The missing had experience, proper equipment, and filed detailed trail plans with the ranger station. Started tracking the pattern back to 1943, she told her partner, Detective Mills, spreading the files across their shared desk. Every 10 to 11 years, like clockwork, 8 to 12 people disappear over a 3-month period, then nothing for another decade. Mills picked up a yellowed report from 1963. Says here the last person to see Harold Brennan was Ranger Thomas Ashworth. Same with most of these cases. Sarah nodded, pulling out more files. That's what caught my attention. Ranger Ashworth has been the reporting officer for disappearances spanning 40 years. Either he's ancient, or something's not right. The personnel records at Shadowpine were frustratingly incomplete. Ranger Thomas Ashworth had been employed there since 1941, but his file contained no photograph, no birth date, no emergency contacts. Just a series of glowing performance reviews and incident reports, all in the same careful handwriting. "We need to talk to him," Sarah said. The ranger station sat at the forest's edge, a log building that seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness. Ranger Ashworth was exactly what Sarah had expected: tall, weathered, with a kind of deep tan that came from decades outdoors. His uniform was impeccable, his handshake firm. "Terrible business, these disappearances," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "I've been saying for years we need better trail markers, more safety protocols." 40 years of saying it, Mills observed. Ashworth smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Time flies when you love your work. The forest becomes part of you after a while. Sarah studied his face. No gray in his hair, no deep lines around his eyes. If he'd been working here since 1941, he'd have to be pushing 90. He looked 50 at most. "We'd like to see where the last victim was found," she said. "Last seen," Ashworth corrected. "Emma Rodriguez's campsite was 3 miles up the Whispering Creek Trail. I can show you tomorrow morning if you'd like." That evening, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her motel room. The feeling followed her home and lingered for weeks. Chapter 2. The Guide. Emma Rodriguez had been excited about her solo backpacking trip. Her blog entries, recovered from her laptop, painted a picture of an experienced hiker looking forward to photographing the fall colors in Shadowpine Forest. Day 1 was perfect. Her final entry read, "Met the nicest park ranger on the trail. He's been here forever and knows all the best spots for photography. Taking his advice and heading deeper into the backcountry tomorrow." Sarah read the entry aloud to Mills as they drove toward the forest. She mentions his timeless quality and how he seemed to know exactly what she was looking for. The campsite showed no signs of struggle. Emma's tent remained perfectly arranged, her gear organized as if she'd simply stepped away for a moment. The only unusual detail was a set of footprints leading away from the campsite, 2 sets. One clearly Emma's hiking boots, the other strange impressions that seemed too deep for normal footwear. "Ashworth said he found the site like this," Mills said, photographing the scene. "Claims he was doing routine patrols when he noticed the abandoned tent." Sarah knelt beside the unusual prints. They were almost human, but wrong somehow, too long, with what appeared to be claw marks at the front. "These don't match any boot I've seen." Following the trail, they found more evidence of Emma's passage: a dropped energy bar wrapper, a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, and always those strange footprints walking alongside hers. The trail led steadily upward, toward the forest's most remote sections. "It's like she was being led somewhere," Sarah murmured. The tracks ended at a rocky outcrop where the trail split into 3 directions. Beyond that point, the forest seemed to swallow all traces of both Emma and her mysterious companion. That night, Sarah dreamed of walking through dark woods, following someone whose face she couldn't see. In the dream, she felt perfectly safe, even eager to continue deeper into the wilderness. She woke with the taste of earth in her mouth and the absolute certainty that something had been calling her name. Chapter 3. The Keeper. The historical records at the county library painted a disturbing picture. Sarah had spent 3 days going through old newspapers, looking for patterns in the disappearances. What she found made her blood run cold. The first cluster of vanishings occurred in 1933, a year before Thomas Ashworth's official employment began. But newspaper accounts from that time mentioned a helpful forest guide who'd been assisting lost hikers for years. The description matched Ashworth perfectly. "Look at this," she told Mills, pointing to a 1954 article. "Margaret Holloway, age 28, experienced mountaineer. Last seen with the forest's most knowledgeable guide, according to witness statements. The guide's description: tall, ageless, with an uncanny ability to find people in the wilderness. The pattern was consistent across decades. People would encounter Ashworth on the trails, usually alone. He would offer guidance, share knowledge about the forest, and gradually lead them away from populated areas. Witnesses always described feeling unusually comfortable with him, as if he were an old friend. He's been hunting here for almost a century," Sarah realized, "and he's careful about it. Never takes more than he needs, never leaves obvious evidence." Mills frowned. "But why? And how is he still alive?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Vance, a folklore professor at the nearby university, had been researching local legends for her book on Pacific Northwest mythology. The indigenous tribes have stories about the Keeper, she explained when Sarah called her, "a forest guardian who maintains the balance between civilization and wilderness. According to legend, he feeds on human life force to sustain the forest itself." "That's just folklore," Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she wasn't sure she believed it. "The stories describe a being that appears human but isn't. It awakens periodically to collect what it needs, then sleeps again. The tribes considered it a natural part of the forest cycle." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How does it collect what it needs? "The legends are vague, but they mention a sacred place where the Keeper stores his harvest, a cave deep in the forest where time moves differently." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every sound from the forest seemed deliberate, purposeful. She found herself standing at her bedroom window, staring into the darkness and fighting the urge to walk outside. Something was calling to her, and part of her wanted to answer. Chapter 4. The Collector. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing old case files, Sarah discovered that 3 previous investigators had looked into the Shadowpine disappearances. All 3 had eventually abandoned their cases, citing lack of evidence and reassignment to other duties. One had taken early retirement, another had moved across the country, the third had simply vanished. Detective Ray Morrison had been investigating the 1983 disappearances when he'd gone missing during a solo trip to the forest. His case file contained detailed notes about Ranger Ashworth, including surveillance reports and photographs. Morrison was convinced Ashworth wasn't human, Sarah told Mills, reading from the detective's handwritten notes. He documented behavioral patterns, physical inconsistencies, and what he called unnatural longevity. The photographs were the most disturbing evidence. Morrison had taken pictures of Ashworth across several weeks, always from a distance. In every image, the ranger appeared identical, same posture, same expression, same ageless features. But there were subtle details that didn't make sense. In one photo, Ashworth was walking across a muddy area, but his feet left no tracks. In another, he was standing in direct sunlight but cast no shadow. "This is impossible," Mills said, studying the images. Sarah had been thinking the same thing, but the evidence was undeniable. Morrison's final note says he was going to confront Ashworth directly. That was the last entry in his file. They found Morrison's car at the Whispering Creek trailhead, exactly where Emma Rodriguez had parked 3 months earlier. The vehicle had been there for 25 years, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Inside, they discovered Morrison's service weapon, his badge, and a journal filled with increasingly desperate observations about Ashworth's true nature. "He's not collecting people for money or pleasure," Morrison had written. "He's farming them, taking what he needs to survive, then sleeping until he needs more. The forest is his territory, and we're just livestock." The journal's final entry was barely legible. "Found his hunting ground, the cave system near Devil's Spine. Going in tomorrow. If something happens to me, don't send a search party. Send an army." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. Ashworth wasn't just a serial killer, he was something else entirely. Something that had been hunting in these woods for generations, perfecting his technique over decades of practice. "We need to find that cave," she said. But as they drove back toward town, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. In her rearview mirror, she caught glimpses of a tall figure standing among the trees, always just at the edge of visibility. When she turned to look directly, nothing was there. Chapter 5. The Harvest. The cave system near Devil's Spine was a labyrinth of limestone passages that stretched deep into the mountain. Sarah and Mills had brought climbing gear, emergency supplies, and enough firepower to handle any normal threat, but they both knew they weren't dealing with anything normal. Morrison's journal mentions hearing sounds from deep in the caves, Sarah said as they prepared their equipment. Breathing, movement, but not quite human. They'd called for backup, but the nearest units were hours away. The state police had been skeptical of their theories, requiring more evidence before committing resources. So Sarah and Mills were on their own, following the trail of a predator that had been hunting for nearly a century. The cave entrance was larger than expected, a natural archway that seemed to exhale cold air. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone, weathered by time but still visible. Sarah recognized them from Dr. Vance's research tribal markings that warned of danger. The indigenous people knew about this place, she realized. They were trying to warn others to stay away. The passage led steadily downward, the walls becoming smoother as they descended. The air grew thicker, carrying strange sense-not decay, but something organic and wrong. Their flashlights revealed scratch marks in the stone, as if something with claws had regularly traveled this route. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above them, but the walls were visible in their flashlight beams. And covering those walls were dozens of cocoons. "Dear God," Mills whispered. The cocoons were made of some organic material that pulsed with faint light. Each one was human-sized, suspended from the ceiling by thick, rope-like strands. Some looked fresh, others appeared to have been there for decades. Through the translucent walls, Sarah could see the shapes of people inside. "They're still alive," she breathed. The cocoons closest to them contained the most recent victims. Sarah recognized Emma Rodriguez's face through the membrane, peaceful but somehow diminished. The woman's skin was pale, her breathing slow and shallow. He's keeping them alive, Mills said, his voice tight with horror. But for what? As if in answer to his question, they heard footsteps echoing from deeper in the cave. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't quite sound human. Sarah drew her weapon, motioning for Mills to do the same. "Welcome to my sanctuary," came a familiar voice from the darkness. Ranger Ashworth stepped into the light, but he was no longer bothering to maintain his human appearance. His skin had a greenish tint, and his eyes reflected their flashlight beams like an animal's. His fingers had elongated into claws, and when he smiled, his teeth were sharp and numerous. "You've been very persistent, Detective Chen. I had hoped you would lose interest like the others." "Let them go," Sarah said, keeping her weapon trained on him. Ashworth laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "They serve a purpose now. Their life force sustains me during my dormant periods. Without them, I would die, and the forest would lose its guardian." "You're a parasite," Mills said. "I am balance," Ashworth replied. "I take only what I need, and I protect what remains. The forest has flourished under my care for centuries." Sarah noticed movement in the shadows behind him, more shapes, human but wrong, emerging from deeper passages. Other creatures like Ashworth, or perhaps previous victims who had been changed by their captivity. "Detective Chen," Ashworth continued, "you would make an excellent addition to my collection. Your life force is strong, your will unbroken. You could sustain me for years." The creature moved with inhuman speed, crossing the chamber in seconds. Sarah fired 3 shots center mass, but Ashworth barely flinched. The bullets passed through him as if he were made of mist. Chapter 6. The Sleeper. Mills's scream echoed through the chamber as Ashworth's claws raked across his chest. Sarah emptied her clip into the creature, but the bullets had no effect. Whatever Ashworth was, conventional weapons couldn't stop him. "Run," Mills gasped, falling to his knees. "Get help." But there was nowhere to run. The passage they'd entered through was blocked by more of Ashworth's creatures. Sarah found herself backing toward the wall of cocoons, her empty weapon useless in her hands. "There's no escape, Detective," Ashworth said, his voice now a wet whisper. "You found my sanctuary, my harvest. You understand what I am." Sarah's back pressed against one of the cocoons, and she felt movement inside. The person within was trying to communicate, weakly scratching at the membrane. She turned to see a face she recognized from the missing persons files, Detective Ray Morrison, still alive after 25 years but aged beyond recognition. His lips moved soundlessly, but Sarah could read his message, "Fire." She remembered the emergency flare in her gear. The cave was filled with organic material, and if Morrison was right, it might be flammable. She pulled the flare from her belt and yanked the activation cord. The chamber exploded into red light. Ashworth shrieked, covering his eyes and stumbling backward. The cocoons began to smoke where the light touched them, and the creatures in the shadows fled deeper into the cave. "The light burns him," Sarah realized. She grabbed Mills under the arms and began dragging him toward the entrance. The flare's light created a protective circle around them, forcing Ashworth to keep his distance. But the flare wouldn't last long, and Mills was losing blood fast. "You cannot escape," Ashworth snarled, his form becoming more monstrous as his human disguise melted away. "I have fed on this forest for 3 centuries. I am eternal." Sarah reached the passage entrance just as the flare began to fade. Behind her, she could hear Ashworth approaching, his claws scraping against stone. She pulled out her emergency light and switched it to its highest setting, creating another barrier of illumination. "The forest doesn't need you," she gasped, hauling Mills up the passage. "It survived before you came, and it'll survive after you're gone." Ashworth's laughter followed them up the tunnel. "I will sleep now, detective, but I will wake again in 10 years, and I will remember you. I will remember your scent, your voice, your face, and when I wake, I will come for you first." They emerged from the cave as the sun was rising. Mills barely conscious but alive. Sarah's radio crackled with static, but she managed to raise the state police. As sirens wailed in the distance, she looked back at the cave entrance. The opening was sealed, solid stone where the archway had been, as if the cave had never existed, but she could still feel something watching from within, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Later, when the rescue teams arrived, they found no trace of the cave system. The rock face was solid granite, undisturbed for millennia. The carved symbols were gone, and even the scratch marks had vanished. Chapter 7: The Awakening. Sarah had requested a transfer the day after the cave incident. The official report listed the case as closed due to lack of evidence, and Mills had been hospitalized with injuries attributed to a bear attack. No one believed their story about Ashworth and the cocoons. But Sarah knew the truth. She'd seen the creature's lair, felt its presence, and barely escaped with her life. More importantly, she'd seen the pattern in the missing persons reports. The cycle would continue. She spent the next 5 years tracking similar disappearances in other national forests. The pattern was always the same: a helpful ranger or guide, clusters of vanishings every decade, and investigators who either gave up or disappeared themselves. Ashworth wasn't unique. There were others like him, scattered across the wilderness areas of North America. Sarah had become an expert on these creatures, these ancient predators that fed on human life force. She'd learned to recognize their signs, to track their movements, and most importantly, to stay alive in their presence. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. Shadowpine National Forest was reporting its first disappearance in 10 years. A young hiker named David Chen, relation to Sarah, had vanished from the Whispering Creek Trail. The reporting officer was Ranger Thomas Ashworth. "He's away," Sarah told her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She'd been preparing for this moment, knowing the creature would eventually emerge from whatever hibernation state it entered between hunting seasons. The drive to Shadowpine took 6 hours. Sarah's car was loaded with equipment she'd acquired over the years: industrial-strength lights, emergency flares, and weapons that might actually work against something not entirely physical. She'd also brought something else: a detailed map of the forest's cave systems, painstakingly researched from geological surveys and tribal records. The ranger station looked exactly as she remembered it. Ashworth was waiting for her, standing in the doorway with that same ageless smile. He looked no different than he had 10 years ago, but there was something in his eyes, a hunger that hadn't been there before. "Detective Chen," he said, his voice carrying that familiar accent. "I wondered when you'd return." "Let him go," Sarah said, not bothering with pleasantries. "David Chen, where is he?" "Safe," Ashworth replied, serving his purpose in the natural order. Sarah felt the familiar dread settling over her, but this time she was ready for it. She trained herself to resist the creature's influence, to maintain her will when it tried to cloud her judgment. "Your sanctuary is gone," she said. "I found the real cave system, the one you're using now." Ashworth's smile faltered slightly. "Impossible. The forest protects its own." "The forest doesn't protect parasites," Sarah said, pulling out her first flare. "It destroys them." The creature's facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of the monster beneath. Sarah had expected this after 10 years of dormancy. Ashworth would be hungry and desperate. That made him dangerous, but also careless. "You think you can stop me?" he snarled. "I am eternal. I have fed on your kind for centuries." "But you're not invincible," Sarah said, backing toward her car. "You need to sleep, to hibernate, and you need a specific environment to store your victims. She'd found the new cave system 3 days ago, hidden deeper in the forest than his previous lair. The cocoons were there, including David Chen's, but this time Sarah had come prepared. She'd mapped every passage, identified every entrance, and most importantly, she'd brought enough firepower to destroy the entire complex. "You're going to wake up one day to find your food source gone," she continued, "and then you're going to starve." Ashworth lunged at her with inhuman speed, but Sarah was ready. She ignited the flare and thrust it toward his face. The creature screamed and recoiled, his form becoming more monstrous as the light burned him. 10 years, he hissed. "I will remember this for 10 years. "Good," Sarah said, getting into her car, "because I'll be waiting." Chapter 8. The Harvest Moon. The explosions echoed through the forest as Sarah's charges detonated deep within the cave system. She'd spent 2 days placing them strategically, ensuring that the creature's entire lair would be destroyed. The cocoons, the passages, the sleeping chamber, all of it reduced to rubble. From her position on the ridge above, she watched columns of smoke rise from the mountainside. David Chen and the other recent victims had been evacuated before the demolition, though explaining their catatonic state to the medical team had been challenging. But Sarah knew this was only a temporary victory. Ashworth was still alive, still hunting. He would find another lair, collect new victims, and continue his cycle. The creature had survived for centuries by adapting to changing circumstances. Her radio crackled with static, then a familiar voice cut through the interference. "Very clever, Detective Chen, but you've only delayed the inevitable." Sarah grabbed the radio. "Ashworth? I am older than your civilization, more patient than your species. I will wait, and I will remember. The forest has many secrets, many places to hide." "I'll find them," Sarah said. "I'll find all of them. And I will be waiting. Every forest you enter, every trail you walk, every shadow you pass, I will be there, watching, hunting, feeding." The radio went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the smoke and the silence. She knew he was right. She destroyed his current lair, but the creature would simply find another. And there were others like him, scattered across the wilderness, following the same ancient cycle. But Sarah had learned something important in her years of hunting these creatures. They weren't invincible. They had weaknesses, needs, patterns that could be exploited. And most importantly, they could be found. She'd spent the last decade building a network of contacts, park rangers, police officers, researchers, and locals who knew the old stories. Together, they were mapping the creature's territories, tracking their movements, and preparing for the next phase of the hunt. Sarah looked down at the destroyed cave system one last time, then turned toward her car. Somewhere in the darkness, Ashworth was watching her, planning his next move, but she would be ready for him. The cycle wasn't broken, but it was no longer invisible, and for the first time in centuries, the predators were being hunted. Chapter 9. The Watcher. 3 months after the cave destruction, Sarah received reports of a new disappearance. This time it wasn't in Shadowpine. It was in Glacier National Park, 800 miles north. A solo hiker named Marcus Webb had vanished from the Highline Trail, last seen talking to a park ranger about backcountry camping permits. The ranger's description was familiar: tall, ageless, with an uncanny knowledge of the wilderness. But this wasn't Ashworth. This was something else, another creature following the same pattern. Sarah's network had been tracking similar cases across the Pacific Northwest. The creatures seemed to be connected, communicating somehow across vast distances. When one's territory was threatened, the others became more active, more aggressive. "They're adapting, Dr. Vance said during their video conference. Your destruction of Ashworth's lair has triggered a response. The other creatures are changing their behavior, becoming more cautious. Sarah studied the map on her wall, marked with pins indicating confirmed and suspected creature territories. The pattern was clear. They were spreading out, avoiding areas where their kind had been discovered. But they still need to feed, she said. They still need the caves, the isolation, the specific conditions for their hibernation cycles. Which means they're vulnerable, Dr. Vance agreed. But they're also learning. The next one won't be as easy to find. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her contact at Glacier. The missing hiker's tent had been found, arranged exactly like Emma Rodriguez's campsite 10 years ago. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, just an empty tent and a cold trail leading into the wilderness. They're calling me in for consultation, Sarah told Dr. Vance. The local authorities are baffled. Be careful, the professor warned. These creatures have had centuries to perfect their hunting techniques. They learn from every encounter, adapt to every threat. Sarah was already packing her gear. The trip to Glacier would take 2 days, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was already too late. The creature there had been hunting longer than Ashworth, perfecting its techniques across multiple hibernation cycles. As she loaded her car, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, in the mud beside her driveway, was a footprint, not human, but close too long, with claw marks at the front. The same type of print she'd seen at Emma Rodriguez's campsite. Ashworth was watching her. Even now, even after the destruction of his lair, he was tracking her movements. The creature was patient, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah drew her weapon and scanned the surrounding forest. Nothing moved in the darkness between the trees, but she could feel eyes on her. Somewhere in the shadows, something ancient and hungry was waiting for her to make a mistake. I know you're there, she called out. I know what you are. The only response was the wind through the trees, but Sarah felt the presence withdraw. For now, Ashworth was content to watch and wait, but eventually he would make his move. Sarah got into her car and drove toward the interstate, checking her mirrors constantly. The creature wanted her to know he was there, wanted her to feel hunted. It was psychological warfare, an attempt to wear down her resolve. But Sarah had been hunting these things for 10 years. She understood their methods, their weaknesses, their need for specific conditions to survive. And she was building something they'd never faced before, a coordinated response to their ancient predation. The highway stretched ahead into darkness, but Sarah wasn't afraid. She was the hunter now, and somewhere in the wilderness, her prey was waiting. Chapter 10. The Dreamer. The Glacier National Park case confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The creature there had been active for over a century, collecting victims during regular hibernation cycles. But this one was different, smarter, more experienced, and far more dangerous than Ashworth. Marcus Webb's body was found 3 days after Sarah's arrival, but not in the way she'd expected. He was alive, technically, but something fundamental had been drained from him. He sat in his hospital bed, staring at nothing, responding to no stimuli. The doctors called it catatonic stupor, but Sarah knew better. The creature didn't take him to a cave, she told Agent Martinez, the FBI profiler who'd been assigned to the case. It fed on him directly, then left him alive but empty. Martinez looked skeptical. That's not how predators work. They don't leave their prey alive. These aren't normal predators, Sarah said. They're something else entirely. Something that feeds on life force, consciousness, the spark that makes us human. The park ranger who'd last seen Marcus was nowhere to be found. According to personnel records, no one matching his description had ever worked at Glacier. The ranger station had security footage showing Marcus talking to empty air, gesturing and nodding as if responding to someone invisible. Mass hallucination, Martinez said. Group psychosis. There's a scientific explanation for this. But Sarah had seen the creature's true forms. She knew they could manipulate perception, make themselves appear human when necessary. The fact that this one didn't show up on camera meant it was evolving, adapting to modern surveillance methods. That night, Sarah dreamed of walking through endless corridors lined with cocoons. But in this dream, the cocoons were transparent, and she could see the faces of everyone who'd ever disappeared in the wilderness. Thousands of them, spanning centuries, all sleeping peacefully while something ancient fed on their dreams. She woke to find her hotel room filled with the smell of earth and decay. The window was open, though she was certain she'd locked it. On the nightstand was a single pine cone, still damp with morning dew. A message. The creature knew where she was, knew she was hunting it, but instead of direct confrontation, it was playing with her, demonstrating its power to enter her space whenever it chose. Sarah grabbed her gear and headed for the forest. If the creature wanted to play games, she'd give it something to think about. She'd been tracking these things for a decade, and she'd learned that they had one critical weakness. They couldn't resist the hunt. The trail led deep into the backcountry, past areas where normal hikers never ventured. Sarah followed the subtle signs-broken branches, disturbed earth, the faint scent of something not quite natural. Her equipment detected electromagnetic anomalies, temperature variations, and other readings that suggested a presence just beyond normal perception. As the sun set, Sarah reached a clearing where the trees grew in perfect circles. The ground was covered with symbols carved into the earth, not the tribal warnings she'd seen before, but something older, more complex, something that hurt to look at directly. "You're persistent," the voice said from the darkness. "I admire that in prey." The creature stepped into the clearing, but this time it wasn't bothering with human appearance. It was tall, angular, with skin that seemed to shift between bark and flesh. Its eyes were the color of deep forest pools, and when it smiled, its teeth were white as bleached bone. "You destroyed my brother's sanctuary," it said. Ashworth was careless, too attached to his territory. I am not so limited. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, keeping her hand on her weapon. "To understand you," the creature replied. "You hunt us, but you don't truly comprehend what we are. We are the forest's immune system, the balance between civilization and wilderness. Without us, your species would consume everything." "You're parasites," Sarah said. "Predators that feed on innocent people." "Innocent?" The creature laughed, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. "Your species destroys everything it touches. We take only what we need, and we preserve what remains. We are conservation in its purest form." Sarah felt the familiar dread settling over her, but this time it was different. This creature was stronger than Ashworth, more sophisticated in its manipulation. It was trying to convert her, to make her understand its twisted logic. "You could join us," it continued. "Become a guardian instead of a destroyer. Help us maintain the balance that keeps your world from falling into chaos." For a moment, Sarah almost considered it. The creature's words carried a hypnotic quality, a sense of truth that was hard to resist. But then she remembered the cocoons, the empty shells of people who'd been drained of everything that made them human. "No," she said, pulling out her emergency flare. "I'll never be like you." The creature's expression shifted to something like disappointment. "Then you'll die like the others, but first you'll dream with us." Sarah felt consciousness slipping away, but she fought against it. She'd trained herself to resist the creature's influence, to maintain her will even when they tried to cloud her judgment. As darkness closed in, she activated the flare and threw it at the creature's feet. The forest exploded into red light, and the creature screamed in pain and fury. Sarah ran toward the tree line, using the light to create a barrier between herself and the predator. Behind her, she could hear it following, crashing through the underbrush with inhuman speed. She reached her car just as the flare burned out. The creature was somewhere in the darkness, wounded but not defeated. As she drove away, Sarah could feel its presence following her, a cold weight that pressed against her consciousness. But she'd learned something important. These creatures weren't just predators, they were zealots, convinced that their predation served a higher purpose. That made them dangerous, but it also made them predictable. Sarah had a new plan. Instead of hunting them one by one, she would expose them all at once. She would force them into the open, where they could be studied, understood, and ultimately defeated. The war between humanity and the ancient predators was about to begin. Chapter 11: The Sleepers. The network Sarah had built over the past decade finally proved its worth. Reports flooded in from across North America. Creatures identical to Ashworth were emerging from hibernation simultaneously, breaking their normal 10-year cycles. Something had triggered a mass awakening. Dr. Vance's research team had been monitoring electromagnetic frequencies in wilderness areas, looking for patterns that might indicate creature activity. What they found was unprecedented, a low-frequency signal originating from multiple points across the continent, all broadcasting on the same wavelength. "They're communicating," Dr. Vance explained during an emergency video conference. "The creatures are connected somehow, sharing information across vast distances. Your interference with their hunting patterns has triggered a coordinated response." Sarah studied the data from her temporary command center in Seattle. The signals were strongest in areas where disappearances had been reported, but they were also coming from remote locations where no human activity had been recorded in decades. "How many of them are there?" she asked. "Based on the signal patterns, we estimate at least 30 active entities across North America, possibly more. They've been dormant for varying periods, but they're all awakening now." The implications were staggering. For centuries, these creatures had been content to hunt in isolation, following their individual cycles. But Sarah's interference had forced them to adapt, to work together for the first time in their long existence. Reports of missing persons began flooding in from national parks, wilderness areas, and remote camping sites. The creatures were no longer being careful about their selection process. They were taking anyone they could find, building stockpiles of victims for an extended period of activity. "They're preparing for war," Sarah realized. "They know we're hunting them, so they're gathering resources for a prolonged conflict." The government response was swift but inadequate. Federal agents were deployed to affected areas, but they were trained to deal with human threats, not ancient predators that could manipulate perception and reality itself. Sarah found herself leading a task force that officially didn't exist. The creature's ability to avoid electronic surveillance made them nearly impossible to track through conventional means. Only those who'd encountered them directly could reliably identify their presence. "We need to change tactics," Sarah told her team during a briefing at an undisclosed location. "These things have been apex predators for millennia. We can't fight them using their rules." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist studying the recovered victims, had discovered something remarkable about their catatonic state. "Their brain activity is unusual," she explained, showing brain scans on the conference room screen. "They're not unconscious, they're dreaming, but the dreams are being directed by an external source. The creatures aren't just feeding on life force, they're feeding on human consciousness itself." Sarah studied the scans. "Can we wake them up?" "Theoretically, yes, but the process would be dangerous. The victims' minds are trapped in a shared dream state, controlled by the creatures." Severing that connection abruptly could cause permanent psychological damage. But if we could access that dream state, Sarah said slowly, we could learn how the creatures operate. We could find their weaknesses. Dr. Vasquez nodded grimly. It would require someone voluntarily entering the dream network. They would have to maintain their consciousness while appearing to be another victim. A double agent, Sarah realized. Someone who could infiltrate their system from the inside. The plan was insane, but it was their only chance to understand the creature's true nature. Sarah volunteered immediately, despite the obvious dangers. She'd been hunting these things longer than anyone. If anyone could maintain their identity while trapped in the dream network, it was her. The preparation took weeks. Dr. Vasquez developed a process to induce the same brain state as the victims while maintaining a lifeline to consciousness. Sarah would appear catatonic to any observing creatures, but her mind would remain partially her own. The risk is enormous, Dr. Vasquez warned. If the creatures detect your deception, they could trap you permanently in the dream state. You'd become one of their victims for real. Sarah understood the stakes, but every day they delayed, more people disappeared. The creatures were growing bolder, hunting in populated areas during daylight hours. Soon, their existence would become impossible to hide from the general public. How long can you maintain the connection? Sarah asked. 72 hours maximum. After that, the risk of permanent psychological damage becomes too great. Sarah nodded. 72 hours to infiltrate a network that had existed for centuries, learn its secrets, and find a way to destroy it. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. Chapter 12. The Network. The induced coma felt like drowning in reverse instead of water filling her lungs. Sarah felt consciousness draining away while something else rushed in to fill the void. The last thing she saw was Dr. Vasquez's concerned face above the medical equipment, then darkness closed over her like a living thing. When awareness returned, Sarah found herself standing in a vast forest that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. The trees were impossibly tall, their canopy blocking out the sky, and everything had the fluid, uncertain quality of dreams. But this wasn't her dream. She could feel other minds pressing against her consciousness, hundreds of them, all connected in a web of shared experience. "Welcome to the dreaming," a familiar voice said behind her. Sarah turned to see Ashworth approaching through the trees, but this version of him was different. Here in the dream space, his true nature was visible. He was older than mountains, his form shifting between human and something far more primal. Around him, the forest itself seemed to respond, branches bending to create a natural throne. "I wondered when you'd find your way here," he continued, "though I admit I didn't expect you to come voluntarily." Sarah fought to maintain her sense of self as other minds brushed against hers. She could feel the victims trapped in the network, hundreds of people from across decades, their consciousness harvested and stored like honey in a hive. This is how you feed, she realized, not just on life force, but on dreams, memories, entire human experiences. "We are the collectors of stories," Ashworth said. "Every human mind contains lifetimes of experience, emotion, creativity. When your bodies die, all of that is lost. We preserve it, give it eternal purpose." Around them, the forest shifted and changed, showing glimpses of other times and places. Sarah saw ancient hunting grounds, primitive caves where the first victims had been stored, the gradual evolution of the creature's methods across millennia. "You're parasites," Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she could feel the network trying to seduce her. The shared consciousness was intoxicating access to hundreds of lifetimes of knowledge and experience, the feeling of being part of something vast and eternal. "We are gardeners," a new voice said, and Sarah turned to see the creature from Glacier National Park emerging from the shadows. "Your species creates beautiful things, Art. Music, love, hope, but you destroy them as quickly as you create them. We harvest the best of humanity and preserve it forever." More creatures appeared among the trees, each representing a different territory, a different hunting ground. Sarah realized she was seeing the entire network for the first time. Dozens of ancient predators connected across vast distances, sharing their harvest in a communal feast of human consciousness. "The girl is strong," another creature observed, this one appearing as a tall woman with bark for skin. Her mind would make an excellent addition to the collection. Sarah felt tendrils of alien thought probing at her consciousness, trying to find weaknesses in her mental defenses. But Dr. Vasquez's preparation had worked. Part of her mind remained hidden, protected by the medical equipment maintaining her physical body. "Show her the garden," Ashworth said. "Let her see what we've preserved." The forest around them transformed into something impossible, a vast library of human experience where memories existed as living things. Sarah saw the dreams of painters who disappeared centuries ago, still creating masterpieces in the shared consciousness. Musicians played instruments that existed only in thought, their compositions echoing through the network for eternity. "Every person we've harvested continues to exist here," the bark-skinned creature explained. "They create, they love, they experience joy and wonder. Death has no meaning in the dreaming." But Sarah could see the truth beneath the beautiful facade. The harvested humans weren't truly alive. They were echoes, shadows of their former selves, their creativity and emotion gradually consumed by the creature's endless appetite. They were dying by degrees, their essence slowly absorbed into the network. "You're killing them," she said. "Slowly, but surely, you're draining away everything that makes them human." "We are refining them," Ashworth corrected. "Removing the pain, the fear, the mortality that limits your species. What remains is pure consciousness, eternal and perfect." Sarah felt the network pressing closer, trying to overwhelm her individual identity with the collective experience. She could feel her sense of self beginning to dissolve, her memories mixing with those of the victims. In moments, she would become another node in the network, another source of food for the ancient predators. But hidden in the depths of her mind, protected by Dr. Vasquez's safeguards, a single thought remained clear. She had to find the network's weakness. The creatures fed on human consciousness, but they were still bound by certain rules. They needed specific conditions to maintain their harvests, required physical anchors in the real world to sustain their dream network. Somewhere in the shared consciousness, there had to be information about their vulnerabilities. Sarah stopped fighting the network's influence and allowed her mind to flow with the collective consciousness. To the creatures, it would appear that she was surrendering, accepting her place in their harvest. But she was actually searching, diving deeper into the shared memories to find the knowledge she needed. What she discovered there would change everything. Chapter 13. The Truth. Deep in the network's collective memory, Sarah found the truth about the creature's origin. They weren't native to Earth, they were refugees from a dying realm, survivors of a cosmic catastrophe that had destroyed their homeworld eons ago. They had fled across dimensional barriers, seeking new hunting grounds and new sources of sustenance. The indigenous peoples of North America had encountered them first, recognizing them as invaders from beyond the natural world. The tribal warnings carved in stone weren't just superstition, they were accurate descriptions of an alien threat that had taken refuge in Earth's wilderness. Your species called us demons. The memory of an ancient creature whispered through the network, but we are simply survivors, adapting to a new environment. Your consciousness proved to be an adequate substitute for what we lost. Sarah saw the creature's true history unfold in the shared memories. They'd once fed on the psychic emanations of their own kind, existing in a symbiotic relationship with beings of pure thought. But their homeworld had been consumed by something even more ancient and hungry entities that devoured entire dimensions, leaving nothing but void in their wake. The Devourers. The memory continued. They follow the scent of consciousness across the cosmos, consuming entire realities. We fled here to escape them, but our presence will eventually draw their attention. The revelation was staggering. The creatures weren't just predators, they were harbingers of something far worse. Their feeding on human consciousness was creating a psychic beacon that would eventually attract the attention of the entities that had destroyed their homeworld. Earth is doomed anyway. Ashworth's voice echoed through the network. The Devourers will come eventually. We're simply harvesting what we can before the end. But Sarah found something else in the memory, a weakness the creatures themselves didn't fully understand. Their connection to the dream network required a constant flow of psychic energy, and that energy had to be processed through specific nodes in the physical world. The caves, the cocoons, the sleeping victims, they were all part of a vast organic computer that maintained the network's integrity. If those nodes could be disrupted simultaneously, the entire network would collapse. The creatures would lose their connection to each other and to their harvested consciousness. They would become vulnerable, mortal, limited to their individual physical forms. Sarah had found the key to defeating them, but now she had to escape the network before they realized what she'd discovered. She could feel the creatures' attention focusing on her, their alien intelligence beginning to suspect that she wasn't truly part of their harvest. The girl knows something, the bark-skinned creature observed. Her thoughts are hidden from us. Impossible, Ashworth replied, but Sarah could sense his growing suspicion. No human mind can resist the network once it's been integrated. Sarah began withdrawing her consciousness from the shared experience, following the lifeline Dr. Vasquez had established back to her physical body. But the creatures were trying to hold her, wrapping tendrils of alien thought around her mind like psychic chains. "She's escaping," one of them cried. "Stop her!" The forest around Sarah began to collapse as the creatures poured their combined will into trapping her consciousness. Trees became grasping claws, the ground turned to quicksand, and the sky filled with the screaming voices of the harvested victims. But Sarah had learned something important during her time in the network. The creatures' greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. Their shared consciousness made them powerful, but it also made them dependent on each other. If she could disrupt their connection even briefly, she might be able to escape. Sarah reached deep into her own memories, drawing on every moment of individual human experience, love, loss, hope, despair, the chaotic beauty of mortal existence. She projected these memories into the network with all the force she could muster, flooding the shared consciousness with purely human emotion. The creatures recoiled from the psychic assault, their alien minds unable to process the raw intensity of human experience. In that moment of confusion, Sarah felt the lifeline to her physical body strengthen, pulling her back toward consciousness. "Find her body," Ashworth commanded as the dream world began to fade around them. "She cannot be allowed to escape with what she's learned." But Sarah was already gone, racing back through the layers of consciousness toward the medical facility where her body lay, waiting. Behind her, she could feel the network reorganizing itself, the creatures adapting to the threat she represented. She had 72 hours to use what she'd learned. After that, the creatures would be ready for her. Chapter 14. The War. Sarah woke to find Dr. Vasquez leaning over her, checking vital signs with obvious relief. The medical equipment showed she'd been unconscious for 36 hours, leaving her 36 hours to act on the intelligence she'd gathered from the network. The nodes, she gasped, still disoriented from her time in the shared consciousness. We have to hit all the nodes simultaneously. Dr. Vasquez helped her sit up, offering water and monitoring her pupil response. What did you find in there? Sarah's mind was still processing the alien memories, the vast scope of the creature's presence on Earth. They're not from here. They're refugees from another dimension, and their feeding is creating a beacon that will attract something worse. Worse than giant psychic parasites? Entities that devour entire realities, Sarah said grimly, but that's not our immediate problem. The creatures maintain their network through physical nodescape systems where they store their victims. If we can destroy all the nodes simultaneously, we can collapse their entire operation. The task force had been tracking creature activity across North America, identifying likely locations for their lairs. But coordinating simultaneous strikes across such a vast area would require military precision and resources they didn't officially have. How many sites are we talking about? Dr. Vasquez asked. Sarah pulled up the data her network had compiled over the past decade. 37 confirmed locations, possibly more. Each one contains dozens of victims in various stages of consciousness harvesting. The logistics were staggering. They would need teams at each location, equipped with specialized gear and trained to handle entities that could manipulate perception and reality. Most importantly, the strikes would have to happen within minutes of each other if the creatures realized what was happening. They could relocate their operations or defend their nodes. I'll need to brief the task force, Sarah said, struggling to her feet despite Dr. Vasquez's protests. We have less than 36 hours to plan and execute the largest coordinated strike against an unknown enemy in human history. The briefing took place in the same undisclosed location where Sarah had first proposed infiltrating the network. The assembled agents, researchers, and military personnel listened in stunned silence as she described what she'd learned from the shared consciousness. These entities have been operating on Earth for centuries, she explained, pointing to locations marked on a continental map. They've perfected their hunting methods, established territorial boundaries, and created a psychic network that spans the entire continent. But they have one critical vulnerability: they're dependent on physical infrastructure to maintain their operations. Agent Martinez, the FBI profiler who'd worked the Glacier case, raised his hand. How do we know destroying these nodes will actually stop them? Because their shared consciousness requires constant psychic energy to maintain, Sarah replied. The nodes process that energy, convert it into a form the creatures can use. Without them, the network collapses and the creatures become isolated, mortal. And the victims? Sarah hesitated. This was the part she'd been dreading. Some of them might survive the disconnection. Others have been in the network too long. Their consciousness has been too thoroughly integrated with the system. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were potentially condemning hundreds of people to death in order to save thousands more. But the alternative, allowing the creatures to continue their harvest indefinitely, was even worse. We need volunteer teams, Sarah continued. People who understand what they're facing and are willing to accept the risks. The creatures will defend their nodes once they realize what's happening. Over the next 24 hours, the task force assembled the largest covert military operation in history. Teams were positioned near each identified node, equipped with industrial lighting systems, thermite charges, and weapons loaded with phosphorus rounds, anything that might work against entities that existed partially outside normal reality. Sarah would lead the strike on Ashworth's territory, the original Shadowpine location where her investigation had begun a decade earlier. It seemed fitting that she would face the creature that had started her down this path. "Remember," she told her team as they prepared for the assault, "these things have been apex predators for millennia. They're intelligent, adaptable, and utterly ruthless. Our only advantage is surprise." As the sun set on what might be humanity's last day of ignorance about the ancient threat lurking in the wilderness, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. In a few hours, the war between humanity and the creatures would begin in earnest. Either they would succeed in destroying the network, or the creatures would adapt once again, becoming even more dangerous than before. There would be no second chance. Chapter 15: The Cocoon. The assault on Shadowpine began at exactly midnight, coordinated with strikes across the continent. Sarah's team had located Ashworth's new lair 3 miles deeper in the forest than his previous cave system, hidden beneath an ancient grove that predated human settlement in the area. The approach was eerily quiet. No night sounds, no wind through the trees, just the soft crunch of boots on fallen leaves and the barely audible hum of their specialized equipment. Sarah could feel the creature's awareness pressing against her mind, but the psychic dampening field generated by Dr. Vasquez's devices kept their influence at bay. "Contact in 30 seconds, whispered Agent Brooks, the team's communications specialist. "All stations report ready." Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear confirmations from teams across North America. 37 simultaneous strikes against targets that most people would never believe existed. If they succeeded, humanity would win its first victory against an enemy that had hunted them for centuries. If they failed, the creatures would go underground again, becoming even more cautious and deadly. The cave entrance was larger than Sarah remembered, a yawning mouth in the earth that seemed to exhale malevolent intent. Ancient symbols covered the surrounding stone, not the tribal warning she'd seen before, but something older, carved by inhuman hands in a script that hurt to look at directly. "Phosphorus charges set," reported Thompson, the team's demolitions expert, "ready to breach on your command." Sarah checked her equipment one final time: industrial spotlights, emergency flares, and a weapon loaded with rounds designed to disrupt psychic energy. It wasn't much against creatures that had survived for millennia, but it would have to be enough. "All teams, this is command," came the voice through their earpieces. "Execute in 3, 2, 1, mark." The explosives detonated simultaneously across the continent. 37 cave systems breached in perfect coordination. Sarah's team rushed into the smoke-filled passage, their spotlights cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. The descent was shorter than expected, leading to a chamber that defied the laws of physics. The space was vast, far larger than the mountain above could contain, and the walls pulsed with organic light. Hundreds of cocoons hung from the ceiling, each one containing a human figure in various stages of consciousness harvesting. "Jesus Christ," Thompson whispered, his voice echoing in the impossible space. But Sarah's attention was focused on the figure standing in the chamber's center. Ashworth was waiting for them, no longer bothering with his human disguise. His true form was revealed tall, angular, with skin that shifted between bark and flesh, and eyes like deep forest pools that reflected their lights back at them. "Detective Chen," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't exist in human vocal cords. "I wondered when you'd come calling." "It's over," Sarah said, raising her weapon. "The network is compromised. All your nodes are under attack." Ashworth smiled, revealing teeth like sharpened wood. "You think you understand what you're fighting, but you know nothing. We are not your enemy. We are your only hope of survival." Around them, the cocoons began to stir. The figures inside were awakening, but not in the way Sarah had hoped. Their eyes opened to reveal the same deep pool reflection as Ashworth's, and she realized with growing horror that some of the victims had been changed, converted into something between human and creature. The network doesn't just preserve consciousness, Ashworth explained. It evolves it. These are the next step in human development, beings that can exist in both the physical and psychic realms. The converted victims began emerging from their cocoons, moving with fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Sarah recognized some of the faceless people who'd been missing for decades, now transformed into something that was no longer quite human. The Devourers are coming, Ashworth continued. A psychic beacon created by our feeding has already drawn their attention across dimensional barriers. When they arrive, only those who have been evolved will survive. Sarah felt her team's resolve wavering as the implications sank in. If Ashworth was telling the truth, they weren't just fighting to save humanity, they were potentially dooming their entire species to extinction by entities from outside reality. "You're lying," she said, but even as she spoke, she could feel doubt creeping into her mind. "Am I?" Ashworth gestured to the chamber around them. "Look at what we've created, a synthesis of human consciousness and our ancient knowledge. These beings could defend Earth against the Devourers, but only if enough of them exist." Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear reports from other teams. The strikes were succeeding, nodes were being destroyed, networks collapsing, but the creatures were fighting back with desperate fury. And in some locations, teams were reporting impossible phenomena. Reality itself seemed to be unraveling as the psychic infrastructure collapsed. "The network stabilizes local reality," Ashworth said, reading her expression. "Without it, the dimensional barriers weaken. You're not saving humanity, you're accelerating its destruction." Sarah looked around the chamber, seeing the truth in Ashworth's alien eyes. The creatures weren't just predators, they were shepherds, preparing humanity for a threat beyond imagination. But their methods were monstrous, turning people into livestock to feed an ancient hunger. "There has to be another way," she said. "There is," Ashworth replied. "Join us willingly. Become the bridge between our species. Help us create enough evolved beings to defend this reality." The offer hung in the air like poison, tempting and terrible. Sarah could feel the weight of the decision, millions of lives depending on her choice. Save humanity by allowing it to be transformed into something alien, or condemn it to face the Devourers as they were. Through her earpiece, she heard the countdown to the final phase of the operation. In 60 seconds, thermite charges would detonate throughout the chamber, destroying the cocoons and killing everyone inside, human and creature alike. Sarah looked at the faces around her team, the converted victims, the ancient predator that had haunted these woods for centuries. In her hand, the detonator felt impossibly heavy. 30 seconds. "Choose," Ashworth said softly. "Evolution or extinction." 20 seconds. Sarah thought about Emma Rodriguez, about Detective Morrison, about all the people who disappeared into the darkness over the decades. They'd been victims, but they'd also been pioneers, the first humans to experience existence beyond the boundaries of mortality. 10 seconds. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, and pressed the detonator. The chamber erupted in white-hot light as the thermite charges ignited. The cocoons burst into flame, the organic walls began to collapse, and Ashworth's scream of rage and despair echoed through dimensions beyond the physical. Sarah felt the network's death scream as 37 nodes died simultaneously, their psychic infrastructure collapsing like a vast house of cards. But even as victory seemed assured, Sarah could feel something else stirring in the space between realities, something vast and hungry, drawn by the network's destruction like sharks to blood in the water. The Devourers had noticed Earth at last. and humanity was about to face its greatest test completely alone.